Hey everyone, this is Thyworm, and today I want to talk about Last Epoch versus Wolcen so you can make an informed decision on which game is the right game for you. Many people in the comments asked me to do a comparison as I play and enjoy both games. So here it is. I'm going to go through all different aspects of both games, provide an overview and every now and then also give my own opinion. At first glance, Wolcen and Last Epoch are very similar games. They're both top-down, loot-driven action RPGs and they offer a lot of skills and build customization and you slaughter countless monsters. But if you play the games for a bit longer, you'll notice there are quite some differences. I'm reviewing Wolcen patch 1.0.12.0 and Last Epoch patch 0.7.7e. Let's start with the current status of both games. Last Epoch is a Steam Early Access title. It's been in development for several years now and started a Kickstarter project in April 2018, raising $250,000. A year later, the game launched into Early Access in April 2019, which is when I first picked up the game. It's been getting steady updates ever since and the planned release is somewhere around the end of 2020. Wolcen Lords of Mayhem wasn't always called Wolcen. It started as Umbra as a Kickstarter in May 2015. 11,000 backers pledged $406,000. The indie studio promised a revolutionary action RPG with an open world, advanced crafting, housing, semi-procedural weaponry and other never-seen-before features. The game entered Early Access in March 2016 and spent many years in Early Access, undergoing various changes. Wolcen finally released in February 2020 without many of the promised features from the Kickstarter, although those promises were by now 5 years old. You might think it is not fair to compare a fully released game to an early access title, but in this case it is perfectly fair. Yes, Wolcen is a fully released game and Last Epoch is not. However, in terms of bugs, stability, balancing, optimization and overall polish, the games are at least very comparable. On most topics, Last Epoch delivers actually a much more stable game. Because Wolcen at launch is still very buggy and suffered from broken mechanics, the games are in a similar state despite their official status. Up next are the classes. Last Epoch has a very traditional class system, like Diablo 2. You choose a base class like the Sentinel, Acolyte, Mage or Primalist, and then you can specialize into 3 subclasses. The Sentinel can become a Paladin with Holy Fire and auras, a Void Knight doing massive void damage and play around with time, or a Forge Guard summoning animated weapons and armor. While each class can use each piece of gear apart from idols, the classes also come with specific archetypes. Classes determine your passives and they determine your skills, which each have their own skill tree as well. At launch there will be a 5th class, the Rogue. Wolcen took a completely different approach here. There are no classes. You're simply the son or daughter of the Inquisitor. You can basically become anything. What skills you can use depends on what weapons you equip. If you equip a gun or a bow, you can use ranged skills. Take a sword and you can use melee abilities. Take one gun and one sword and you can do both. While this sounds like a good idea or maybe even an original idea, there is one big drawback to this system: versatility, ironically enough. You see, no classes means no separate passive trees either and no separate skills. You're always making use of the same passive nodes no matter what items or skills you have, and you're always tied to the same skills no matter which character you choose. And there are only 40 skills in the entire game. That's not much for an action RPG. Last Epoch has many more. The Sentinel alone, one class out of the available 4, has 26 possible skills to spec into, most of those with their own specialization tree. And the Sentinel comes with his own passives as well, which are specifically designed to work well with those skills, including passives for each subclass, the Paladin, Void Knight and Forge Guard. Last Epoch has around 100 skills available as of now. I'd say it wins this round. Let's talk about the campaign and lore. Last Epoch is a game where time plays an important role. Time traveling through different eras is what the main storyline revolves around, with you discovering shards of time, allowing you to travel to the same locations in different time zones. There are 4 in total, each with their own distinct look. During the campaign, you'll be following a storyline around two gods that are warring for control, while mere mortals around them try to make the best of the situation. The story isn't fully finished yet, with 2 more acts to go. Regarding the campaign, it's clearly not been the focus so far in Last Epoch. There are hardly any cinematics, there's hardly any voice acting. The whole campaign experience has a decent storyline, but the delivery is bland and not very interesting. It's definitely not a game that immerses you in its storyline by any means. Wolcen has had a big focus on the campaign. It's got very nice cinematics, some great voice acting, a standard but nonetheless enjoyable storyline and many hours of campaign fun. You're the adopted child of the Grand Inquisitor Heimlock, who's facing a new demon threat. You and your 2 siblings are sent out to investigate until you discover that you have demonic powers as well. This doesn't sit well with some of the rather strict inquisitors who are now after your head. Between avoiding your untimely execution by former friends and slaying tons of demons, you unravel the plot of the Demon Master plan to take over the world. Another nice feature in Wolcen is the fact that you can completely skip the campaign on your second character, given that you completed it on your first. As the campaign is rather long and contains some very tedious bosses, this is a very nice feature to have. Last Epoch makes you play through the campaign with each character, and you should as well, because there are many passive skill points as quest rewards, which makes it worth it. In terms of length, the campaign in Last Epoch is a lot shorter than that in Wolcen. In terms of campaign and lore, Wolcen is the clear winner of the 2. Up next, endgame. In this area, both games are rather bare bones. Last Epoch offers 2 endgame modules at the current moment of writing. The Monolith of Fate, which is basically a string of maps with increasingly more difficult modifiers and better loot, and there's the Arena, a wave-based encounter with more loot the more waves you survive. Both game modes feature some randomized elements, such as quests, but as of now the levels themselves are not randomized, making them a bit boring after a while. There will be randomization at release, however. Wolcen also offers 2 endgame modules, Contracts and Expeditions. They work in similar ways, with maps being created, including a random quest, just like in Last Epoch. Contracts are just singular maps which yield a reward when completed. Expeditions allow you to influence the modifiers on those maps, increasing difficulty and rewards. Once you complete an expedition floor, you can continue to the next one, making your run more difficult and increasing the loot you would get. On top of these 2 modules, Wolcen has a rather elaborate city building system which ties in nicely with the storyline. It's a massive grind rebuilding the city, but it does give you an additional purpose to grind the expeditions besides the loot fever. Rebuilding your city also increases rewards you're getting. You can send your own citizens to do some jobs, you can trade on the black market and do other stuff as well. It's fair to say that Wolcen offers more than Last Epoch, at least in terms of content. Whether you enjoy that particular content will most likely depend on other factors, which we will get into. One of those factors would be combat. In both games, you'll spend 80% of the time fighting monsters. That means it is nice, or even vital, that combat feels fun, impactful and visceral. Games like Grim Dawn and Path of Exile do this very well, where you feel powerful as you make your way through the maps. Wolcen does this also pretty well, depending a little bit on the class you pick. Running and gunning and dodging feels pretty good. Some of the mage spells are very spicy. Melee combat definitely has that sense of impact as well, and overall Wolcen performs well on the action part in action RPG. Last Epoch has some issues on this front. Combat feels rather bland, whether you're melee or magic. You don't feel the impact of your actions, both in sound and graphics. It lacks these visceral animations that make you feel powerful, and that is a shame. However, if you disregard how the combat looks, you take a look at how the flow of combat works, Last Epoch is the clear winner. Last Epoch is much more responsive to player key input. If you press a spell, your character almost instantly performs that spell. Wolcen, on the other hand, suffers from multiple sources of lag. Server lag, input lag, and a horrible amount of animation locking. While everything looks cool when you're watching someone play, actually playing the game yourself feels very sluggish. In melee, this is particularly bad because dodging or drinking a potion isn't possible until your character finishes whatever animation he's doing. It kills the flow of combat and really takes a big chunk away from the otherwise meaty action. Depending on what you value more in combat, the flow or the feel, you now know who's the winner. Overall, there's no clear winner here. Let's take a look at balancing and game mechanics. If you enjoy the character building process in action RPGs, fiddling around with different skills, trying to min-max builds and try to create truly broken characters, then Last Epoch has a lot more to offer than Wolcen. Last Epoch offers a much deeper RPG experience with customizable skills that synergize well with other skills. The unique feature of Last Epoch is that besides a passive skill tree, you can also specialize your individual skills with their own skill tree. This leads to basically endless build options, where some people have created very innovative builds that completely destroy endgame content. Wolcen is less complex. The turntable passive wheels are a nice feature, but not more than a gimmick. Stat distribution is completely trivialized by the way stats are implemented, with most builds simply putting all points in a single passive stat. Skills can be modified, but most of these modifications are very basic or include a damage conversion, allowing for little variety. In terms of additional game mechanics like gear, stats and passives, Last Epoch does a better job. The game offers quite some defensive options in terms of protections, dodge, evasion, energy shield and armor. The passive trees allows for some very original additional defensive and offensive effects, such as additional charges of skills, triggered abilities, etc. There are many separate stats to use and they all work well together with several gaps that can be reached. Wolcen on the other hand is much more simplistic in its execution. It has less stats, less variables, a less exciting passive system, less skills, with mostly just percentages increasing the passive nodes and only a few really interesting major nodes. It limits the routes you can go to and feel you've created a cool build. In terms of balancing, both games have some issues. You should realize that balancing an action RPG is extremely tough because of the enormous number of variables available. In both games, however, it's not that easy to create a build that does well in endgame. Making your way through the campaign and leveling is virtually possible with any build. There are no issues there. Last Epoch skills are much more balanced than the ones in Wolcen, for the record. Wolcen had completely broken skills and still does have a few, while others like summoner skills feel unimpactful. Last Epoch has this situation mostly under control, but some skills still fall off in endgame. Then, loot and crafting. I feel both games in this regard are quite similar. Loot is plenty, loot is valuable, both games have a healthy pool of uniques as some chase items, both items have uniques as build enablers, and overall I haven't found many major differences in loot between Last Epoch and Wolcen. One big difference, at least currently, is character customization. In Last Epoch, most loot doesn't actually impact the way your character looks, with the exception of some uniques and weapons and shields. You won't see your character visually progressing over time. Wolcen has this in place and the character models do look extremely good, enabling you to make some awesome looking heroes. In terms of crafting, both games have a crafting system which works well. Wolcen's crafting system seems a bit more complicated with more various crafting items and let's say more non-intuitive matters going on. For example, you should really watch a few videos on how different gems influence the crafting of various endgame items in order to get the best out of them. You can alter gear that way to give it the highest chance of proccing what you want, but the system itself isn't all that easy to understand at first. You could argue it is a very elaborate system. I just haven't really done much Wolcen crafting myself, so I won't get into this much. Last Epoch is crafting that is a little bit more straightforward perhaps, as at least the UI clearly shows what you're doing, but it is also a rather deep system that definitely requires a bit of explanation, which is why I've made a crafting guide series, because it's not clear from the game itself how crafting exactly works. It's not that hard to get into, however, and crafting items in Last Epoch is very fun to do. There's a decent amount of RNG involved, just like in Wolcen, but it never really feels unfair. Covering some technicalities to ensure this is a complete overview, let's talk graphics and sound. It shouldn't be surprising, but Wolcen's graphical fidelity is unmatched, not even when comparing it to Last Epoch, but when comparing it to any action RPG out there. It is simply a beautiful, stylized game with a clear vision on the graphics, a good visibility of monsters, gorgeous particle effects, and a game that's dripping with atmosphere. It's a joy to traverse the levels and walk around the maps. The sound design matches the visuals well with meaty, beefy sound effects for spells, guns, and very decent ambient sounds as well. During cinematics, the sounds elevate the imagery and brings the story to life. Last Epoch has a much more simplistic look, although it has improved a lot since they introduced patch 0.7.7, where the game received a massive overhaul in graphics. It does look very nice in my opinion, insane, but there's no way this game will reach Wolcen levels of graphics. In terms of sound design and music tracks, the game opts for a very melancholic feel, which may or may not fit the game, that's up to you. Where Wolcen takes a much more generic action RPG soundtrack, Last Epoch really tries to differentiate itself from its competitors, resulting in a distinguishable soundtrack that some people love and some people don't. Sound effects are a work in progress as well, and are also a reason that combat doesn't feel as impactful yet, together with a lack in convincing animations. A recently hired full-time animation lead should bring some needed upgrades to this system. Talking optimization, by which I mean technical optimization, both games have some issues actually. Last Epoch has a tendency to turn even high-end systems into a helicopter, with the fans going completely crazy while eating enormous percentages of CPU and GPU resources. These issues used to be all over the place, regardless of character you played, monsters on screen or zone you visited. These days, after a year in early access, optimization has improved a lot. It is still not in a state where a constant solid 60 frames per second at 1080p on an RTX 2080 with an i7 is possible. Usually I get 60 frames per second, but like 5% of the time there are frame rate drops, lag and sometimes stutters. If this is unacceptable for you, do not buy Last Epoch at this moment in time. Wolcen, however, isn't optimized either. Whenever I start an expedition, the game freezes. Walking in town is laggy as well. A lot of monsters on screen result in frame rate drops. These issues were less noticeable than in Last Epoch for sure, but recent patches in Wolcen actually made my performance worse, and I think by now Last Epoch might run better than Wolcen. I honestly didn't think this would be the case a couple of months ago, but the situation has changed a bit. Then the price point of both games. Last Epoch goes for €30, Wolcen for 35. €30 for an early access game is pretty steep, but the community has a lot of influence in the development of the game, with the devs taking feedback to heart and implementing community suggestions. It led to community designed uniques, community designed skill trees, new monsters, abilities and a range of UI improvements. You pay to be able to influence the game, you also pay to play a very fleshed out game already. You could however wait till the game is officially released and then pick it up. You'd be stealing money basically, because the game will be sold for $10. I do expect some microtransactions to come in however, because the store button already exists. Wolcen is only €5 more, €35, but for a released game it has a lot of issues and is by no means finished. There are numerous bugs and balancing issues that need solving, and the devs posted an update recently that the upcoming months will be spent on improving and stabilizing the game rather than adding new content, which emphasizes once more the broken state that Wolcen launched in. So what audience are these games for, now that you've heard all of this? Wolcen may tailor to a bit more of a casual audience, without meaning anything good or bad by using the word casual. If you would put some action RPGs on a scale from simple to complicated, so let's say from Diablo 3 to Path of Exile, then Wolcen leans more towards Diablo 3, where Last Epoch would lean more towards Path of Exile. In terms of complexity, skills and game audience, Last Epoch is very similar in my opinion to a game like Grim Dawn. Wolcen seems to be more on par with Diablo 3. In terms of momentum, Last Epoch is still getting more and more players to join the game. It's still in that stage working towards a release, and while the absolute numbers aren't booming by any means, there is a very solid core community playing this game and it is growing and growing. Wolcen on the other hand reached a humongous 127,000 players at launch in February, so only 2 months ago, and the player base has been reduced to around 3,000 by now. That's still a very solid core, but I would say it's a very big fall off for that initial number in a short period of time, and it hasn't stabilized yet either, meaning that still more and more people are leaving the game. The upside is, I guess, that the devs must have gotten so much money that they should be fine developing this game for a while, which is needed as well. It'll take some time, but hopefully this game makes some sort of a comeback, because the hype was real, the disappointment at launch was also real, but despite all that, the game itself is solid enough to build on. It does need work, however. I hope it could shed some light on what these two games are basically about. Thanks so much for watching the video and making it towards the end. If you have any questions, just put them down in the comments. Love you all. Bye bye.